Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our Codeship webinar about using Docker for continuous deployment. I'm Manuel Weiss, co-founder and director of marketing here at Codeship and the manager of our webinar program. And joining me today is our customer success engineer, Ethan Jones. Ethan is responsible for introducing users to our CI infrastructure for Docker and helps solving all of your support tickets at Codeship. And today, Ethan will talk about how to use Docker for and with continuous deployment. First, we'll have a look at the ecosystem for Docker deployment and hosting solutions, for container orchestration, and some more. And then Ethan will walk you through some real-life examples on how to deploy your apps with Docker to some of the most common deployment targets like AWS, Google Cloud, or Heroku. At Codeship, we built the CI platform with native Docker support, so we feel confident we have a few valuable things to say about this topic. Um, Ethan's presentation will take about 30 minutes and we'll collect questions during the talk, and I will answer a bunch of your questions in the chat window. But we'll also do a 15-minute Q&A session after the presentation where we will go more into detail about some of the questions you asked in the chat. And we will also provide code examples for everything that Ethan shows on the screen today in a public repo on GitHub later this week. Lastly, I want to mention that we are recording this presentation and we will send the video and other relevant material like slides and helpful blog posts, articles, documentation, etc. in the upcoming days. So let's get started, and I'm handing over to you, Ethan.
Thanks, Manny. So as Manny said, today we're going to be talking about using Docker images for continuous deployment, but we're also going to be talking about using Docker images with continuous deployment. And what I mean by that is when we say Docker images for continuous deployment, part of what we're talking about is a CD process that involves deploying Docker or deploying with Docker. And when I say with continuous deployment, what we're talking about is leveraging Docker to build a more flexible and more customizable CD process using a tool like Codeship's Docker support. But you don't necessarily have to be deploying Docker itself or deploying Docker images to take advantage of how Docker can help out your continuous deployment strategies. And that's actually where I want to start, is just with a quick note to say you don't have to deploy Docker to deploy with Docker. And this actually comes up a lot, especially for new teams, because a team will sit down and they'll be evaluating how Docker might make sense for their organization, and they see all the benefits for using Docker locally for the developers, easier to work on the code and parity between machines, and higher productivity. But then the question comes up, eventually, what do you do with production? Do you have to overhaul your production environment and switch it to Docker? Do you have to learn some new Docker production environment techniques? So it goes from just putting your Docker app together and getting back to work to now a full cycle beginning to end overhaul of the project. Or if you're getting ready to launch a new project and you just want to look at Docker for the first time for that project, you also need to learn a lot of new stuff about production hosting or production support. And I like to bring up this caution right at the start, which is you definitely don't. If you're really new to Docker and you're looking at it, it's totally fine to use Docker just locally, maybe even use Docker in CI/CD with a tool like Codeship. But then when you go to release your code, you're releasing normal code just like you always have a typical deployment, maybe Heroku, maybe DigitalOcean, AWS, Rackspace, but you're just releasing your code the same way you always have, even if you're using Docker locally and up through the CI/CD process, because there's a lot Docker can do for your continuous deployment strategies that don't require you deploy Docker. And so this is a really simplified graphic just to sort of explain the point. And I also want to take a moment and say most of what we're going to cover today is going to be a little bit simplified. We're really going to be focused on answering some high-level questions about what does deploying with Docker mean? How can you use Docker as part of a continuous deployment strategy? Does Docker make sense in different contexts? And then we're going to look at some of the ecosystem around it as well. You've heard about things like AWS's Docker support, maybe Kubernetes, so we're going to look at that whole spectrum of services. And then we will show you some actual code examples using Codeship just to drive home some of these Docker deployment strategies in a real-world sort of way. But we're going to mostly keep it fairly high level throughout and just try to give you some ways to think about continuous deployment as it pertains to Docker. And so back to that previous point, if you have something like what we see here, where you have an application image, which is running your tests, either locally or perhaps also in a CI/CD tool, you can just do something like this, a normal deployment to your production environment, just running your code, no images involved. Ultimately, your code lives in a repo, even if you also have Docker files in that repo because you've taken the time to set Docker up for your team to use locally, you can still just deploy the code and act as if it's not Dockerized for the purpose of actually hosting the production version. So I just like to get that out of the way because I think it's important to lower that barrier to entry, that you don't need to tackle this whole problem to start getting a lot of benefits of Docker, and particularly even benefits in your continuous deployment process, which is what we're talking about today. And now I do want to take a look at the landscape, as I mentioned. And so if we look at some of the big players here, you see AWS, which you may be using without Docker, but it has a whole spectrum of tools that work with Docker. Heroku, of course, now has native Docker support. We see Docker itself because they've got Docker Cloud. They've got Docker Swarm. Microsoft Azure is something you might increasingly be hearing about because Microsoft has invested heavily in great Docker support for Microsoft technologies, as well as in building out Microsoft Azure to have great support for Docker applications, whether they are Microsoft technologies or not. Kubernetes, which is an interesting conversation all by itself because it's got some overlap with Docker, but it's not always exactly the same thing. And then Google Cloud, which can have overlap with Kubernetes, can be competing with AWS, or could just be an environment you like for a variety of different reasons. And of course, as Docker continues to grow at such a fast clip, we could have easily put 2 or 3 dozen more logos on here. We're focusing here just on sort of the big ones, the ones you're definitely likely to hear about and read about, and the ones we get asked the most often about. One thing I want to make sure to note here is we've got ebooks and possibly a few webinars out here for almost everything you see. So while this is going to go through just sort of high-level look at these services and the trade-offs of each, if you want more information, and specifically more information of any of these particular services with Codeship, you will find ebooks, and for some of them we've got webinars, and for anything we don't have, we've got more materials coming out very, very soon. So just getting started now, let's take a look at some of the most popular Docker deployment situations. So these are the things that if you're looking at how do I deploy my Docker apps, these are going to be the things you hear the most often. And then once we look at each of these services and sort of evaluate the trade-offs and reasons for each of them, we'll switch gears and look at some actual deployment strategies using Docker. So how you might actually use Docker in a continuous deployment situation to any of these particular services. And I'm going to start with AWS because AWS is obviously one of the biggest of all the big brands. And if you start looking at AWS, one of the things you'll see is AWS obviously doesn't mean one thing. They've got dozens and dozens of services. And for the purposes of this, the 3 you're most likely to hear about and most likely to be considering are Code Deploy or ECR ECS or Elastic Beanstalk. So these are all AWS services. All of them will, to a degree, support your continuous deployment process with Docker. And so how do you know which one to look at? And maybe as an adjacent question, why would you be evaluating AWS, period? So AWS is super powerful, super flexible. They have a solution to most problems you may have built out. It's a very sort of full spectrum cloud offering. It's not always the easiest to get going. It's not always the easiest to maintain or understand. Compared to much simpler hosted platform solutions, AWS and Google Cloud both might be very, very appealing based on price. That's because so much of the maintenance or overhead or understanding will ultimately fall on you. But they are great, reliable, flexible, customizable services, both AWS and incidentally Google, which we will look at down the line. But starting here, code deploy, ECR, ECS, or Elastic Beanstalk. So what do they mean and how do you pick between them? So looking at this just at a high level, code deploy depends on your infrastructure existing. It's high level. It's about as turnkey as you can get with AWS. You need to have an EC2 machine configured. It needs to be set up with your databases and everything else it takes to instantiate your app. And code deploy is just going to sling your code over to the machine. It's almost equivalent, and this is a great simplification, but it's almost equivalent to just a classic sort of FTP approach. So with code deploy, what you're saying is you're going to set up that machine once. You at least need the capacity to set it up. And from there, releasing your code is really your primary objective. So code deploy is great for very static resource needs and very simple deployment situations. Now, Elastic Beanstalk, on the other hand, gives you a lot of control over the resources and machines and infrastructure itself. You can create and remove resources programmatically. You can scale resources. It is a very powerful way to deploy your applications because a lot of provisioning and orchestration of machines themselves become part of your deployment strategies if you want them to be. You will find a lot of material out there on quote-unquote simple ways to get started with Elastic Beanstalk, but it's pretty much never the simplest option in any toolkit. But it does allow you to grow going forward into things where you might need nodes, multiple clusters, you might have resources you need to change on the fly. And Elastic Beanstalk's really great for that, and now has pretty great Docker support as well for actually releasing with Docker. And then if we look at ECS ECR, ECS ECR is something Amazon built natively for Docker. So it's the Elastic Container Service and the Elastic Container Registry. So these are meant to deploy Docker apps. And in the case of ECR, it's an image registry just like Docker Hub or just like Quay. So ECR is actually an image registry you push to, and then you can use ECS to orchestrate those images. And one way to look at this ECS ECR option is it kind of splits the difference between code deploy and Elastic Beanstalk. So it's much simpler than Elastic Beanstalk in terms of how much you can do with the infrastructure. You can still do some things with it. You can create resources, but you can't get quite as granular about things like scaling or changing resources or some of the more fine-grained control you get with Elastic Beanstalk. So ECS ECR gives you some resource control programmatically, but is simpler, and it takes advantage of a lot of the Docker native patterns like image pushes. So how you pick between these services comes down to what your infrastructure needs are longer term, how much dynamic control you'll need over them, and how Docker native, using patterns like pushing images, you want your release strategy to be. Now, I also want to caution here that anybody listening that is a real AWS wonk is probably taking a lot of issues with the way I'm summarizing this, and that's fair and true. AWS is sort of a tunnel you can go down for a very long time. There's a lot of nuance and complexity to it. I'm trying to abstract it as much as possible and just give you some pointers and useful ways to think about evaluating these. This is by no means a definitive look at the specifics of these services. But this is one way you can look at which AWS service may be right for you. If we take a look at Heroku next. So Heroku Standard, or now Heroku has a Docker-based release strategy, which is the same thing as we see with ECR. You can use an image push standard Docker pattern to release your code onto Heroku rather than your Heroku deployment scripts. And that's really cool because it fits into things you're already doing with Docker or in Docker workflows. So the question of, should you stick with Heroku Standard or should you make this switch to Heroku Docker? It's honestly just a question of how comfortable you feel maintaining and troubleshooting images. If your images are going to crash on deployment for some reason, do you feel comfortable understanding your images enough and troubleshooting Docker architectures and Docker applications enough to resolve them? If you feel much more comfortable just running the code, Heroku Standard probably makes sense for you to stay on indefinitely or to start using. But if you feel like you're going to be fully capable or pretty well versed in troubleshooting issues that may be more specific to a Docker image-based setup, then making the switch to Heroku with Docker is super simple. It's going to make everything Docker native and work the same on Heroku as it does locally. Again, you just need some of that mental concept and mental confidence that you can then resolve issues that may come up that are maybe more Docker architecture specific. And then if we look at this one, what is Kubernetes? So Kubernetes is sort of a side conversation, and we do have a great ebook out there on Kubernetes as well, so I definitely recommend taking a look at that. And Kubernetes is a way to orchestrate and manage and provision fairly sophisticated and custom deployments. Its analog within the Docker ecosystem is Docker Swarm, which I'm not going to look at too much today, but if we talk about Kubernetes, know that Docker has its own solution called Docker Swarm for very similar problems. It's just integrated into Docker. Kubernetes is the more widely adopted right now, sort of open version. It comes from Google, who obviously have a lot of experience orchestrating large-scale computing. And so Kubernetes is a way, if you've got some fairly intensive and complex production needs, for you to manage that with Docker. It's got some trade-offs because even though it uses Docker images, it doesn't use any of the Docker domain language. So it's got its own CLI, its own commands, its own YAML configuration files. So it might feel like you're duplicating a lot of work you did just to get Docker working because you might be doing a lot of things once for Docker and then again to get the same images deploying and provisioning and orchestrating correctly with Kubernetes. And that's actually accurate. You do have to do some of that duplication. But the trade-off there is that there's a lot of openness to it, a lot of flexibility. You can accomplish a lot because it is sort of its own standard that can reuse Docker images, but can manage your servers in a way that is not fully tied to just Docker native commands or even Docker native limitations. So it will let you do a lot of things exactly the way you want if you are managing a fairly complex team or fairly complex project. If you are a strong DevOps advocate or very experienced with DevOps, Kubernetes still might make sense for you even if it's a smaller project with smaller needs, and that's just because it will feel like the kind of thing you like doing. It's very DevOpsy, very DevOps-centric, and a lot of the patterns it picks up may make sense for you. But if you're not a particularly passionate about just implementing DevOps, or you don't have a lot of complex long-term orchestration production needs, or maybe even short-term, Kubernetes probably doesn't make sense for you too much right now because it will be a lot of extra work for things you can probably accomplish slightly similar other ways. But for a lot of teams, it's going to be almost a necessity. And like I said, we do have more materials out there specifically looking at how Kubernetes works in continuous deployment with Codeship. Okay, so that's a little bit of the ecosystem. Hopefully you have some information there on how you go about actually evaluating these different tools and different services. For the AWS ones, like I said, we've got some great ebook material, including one coming out next week on Elastic Beanstalk. We've got ebooks out there for Kubernetes as well, and we've got example repos for most of these things you'll find in our GitHub. So now let's talk about using Docker for deployments specifically. So leveraging Docker images to accomplish our continuous deployment strategies. And if we take a look at this fairly simplified graph, we can get a good sense of how this design pattern is almost always going to be implemented. So over here, you'll see I have the exact same application image with my tests. This is what's running locally, and this is what's also going to run as part of my CI/CD process. But then down here, I've got a new image I'm building to the right, and this is my deployment container. And so a deployment container is essentially another Docker image I build that has the single job of grabbing the code from my main image or my main images and taking a whole bunch of logic or tooling or resources it needs to connect to my production infrastructure or my orchestration services to run my deployment commands. And so the deployment container is the image that specifically ships my code. And down here we say production environment running Docker. That's not necessarily true. It could still be a production environment not running Docker, just like we saw earlier, and you can still make use of this deployment container strategy. So I'm going to jump in now and look at a few code examples of how you will accomplish this. But again, the workflow is we've got one image or multiple images to be more accurate to build and test and run our application. Those are going to pass code onto an image specifically designed to run the resources and tooling we need for our deployments. And that deployment container image built for CI/CD is ultimately what deploys to our production environment or our orchestration and provisioning services. So let's jump into a couple code examples and take a look. I want to start with AWS since I mentioned AWS earlier, and I'm going to take a look at this file. Now, this is not a webinar specifically about Codeship's Docker support, but to show you some real-world strategies, I do have to show you some files. So I'm going to show you how this is implemented specifically on Codeship, because that's the one I know the best, and Codeship is ultimately what pays for us to be here helping you out with these webinars. So forgive me for using Codeship products specifically, but these strategies translate whether or not you're using Codeship. They would work in any CI/CD sort of setup. It's more conceptual. On Codeship specifically, you're going to create this Codeship steps YAML file. This is the YAML file that defines your CI/CD pipeline, all the commands you run in your CI/CD process. Most CI/CD services have some version of this. And if we take a look at some of the commands in our YAML file, in this case, this is an AWS repo, you'll see I'm running some fairly simple AWS commands here. There's AWS right here, some code deploy commands, elastic beanstalk commands, maybe not super representative of a real world scenario, but it definitely does highlight that these are normal, straightforward, vanilla AWS commands. Now the key concept, if we switch back here, is that we need a deployment container. And so on Codeship's Docker infrastructure, all of your commands run on containers that you define. And if I take a look here, you can see I'm specifying the service for the command. In this case, it's a service I've called deployment. And then I pop open this second file, which is called Codeship services YAML. This is essentially a mirror of a Docker Compose file, customized for CI/CD, but uses the same syntax and options and directives as your standard Compose file. And so I'm telling these commands, these AWS S3 commands, that I want to run them on a container called deployment. And so if I look at my services file, you can see that I am indeed defining that container. It's building a Docker file. And if I take a look at the Docker file right here, you can see that I am fetching the AWS CLI. And so in this case, since I am building a container with the AWS CLI, in my CI/CD pipeline, I can almost imagine that I've got, in my CI/CD pipeline, I can almost imagine I've got just an AWS CLI terminal open. It happens to be a container, so I'm referencing the container with that CLI. But then just thinking of that container now as a terminal, I can pass it Amazon commands, just as if I was interacting with Amazon from my local machine. And that's exactly what we see over here. I've now got a deployment container with the AWS CLI, so I can run these AWS commands. You will see in the service definition, because the AWS CLI obviously needs to log in, I'm also passing it my environment variables, which is theoretically how I give it the information it needs to know how to authenticate with AWS. That's happening through an encrypted file to keep it secure. And I won't go into details on that, but we do have a webinar we did a little while back that will go into a lot more detail on how to use the encryption and how to build out these two files more specifically. Now, if I take a look again at the steps file, you can see this is one option for a deployment. So just using typical commands on a deployment container. If I go a little further down, though, what you'll see in this case, and I'll space it out for clarity, you'll see I'm doing an image push. So here I'm saying type push. I'm specifying a registry, which in this case is my AWS ECR registry. I give the image a name, and then I use a service, another Docker container, to provide my authentication tokens for the image push. I'm not going to get into specifics on how this works. There is more material in some webinars we've done in the past as well covering this. But the main takeaway here is two different ways to deploy. I can do an image push to my ECR registry if I'm going with a setup where that controls my deployment, or I can build a container with the AWS CLI if I'm going with a setup where that controls my deployment, and I can just run the commands as we see here. So this is a great AWS example. And like I said, this is public. And these deployment containers, again, what we see here that we've defined for AWS, as well as the other ones I'm about to show you, are all public on our GitHub page, so we will be sure to include them. Now, let's take a look at Heroku. So I'm going to look at another Codeship steps file. And if we see here, let's space this out again just to make it a little more clear. You can see I'm running Heroku deployments. So just simple Heroku deployment commands, very straightforward, and they're running on a container I've defined called Heroku deployment. And so if I look at my services file, which is again where I define all of my containers, you'll see once again I'm building a Docker file. Once again I'm providing some credentials here and encrypted environment variables. And if I take a look at that Docker file, you'll see that I am grabbing the Heroku toolbelt. So same situation as AWS. I've defined a container here that can accept Heroku commands. And so now in my CI/CD pipeline, I can run Heroku deployment commands on that container. So switching gears once again over here, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. A container customized just for the purpose of releasing my code runs all of my deployment commands. Incidentally, if I wanted to open up this other example, and let me go ahead and take a look here at another steps file, right here, you can see in this case I'm doing an image push. This is also an image push deployment. This is using Heroku's Docker support because what I'm pushing to is my Heroku image registry. Another service that we've built here provides our credentialing. And by the way, when I say it provides our credentialing, most of these registries have authentication token systems, not just simple username and passwords. And for Heroku, Google, and ECR, Codeship has built out images you can use to do that authentication. So I don't mean to glance over that. Like I said, there are webinars with expanded information on that, but we've got services out there to help you get started, and you can look a little bit back in our resources and find a lot more material on it. But in this case, once again, I'm doing a push to a registry. In this case, it's Heroku. So I can deploy with Docker on Heroku with an image push, or I can use a deployment container with Heroku to run the commands. And we've got the exact same pattern here for Google Cloud. So I'm not going to get too much more into detail on this one because there's really not much more to show you. It works exactly the same way. I can run a script on a container I've defined that builds out my Google Cloud CI, or as you can see here, I can do an image push to a Google Cloud GCR registry. So for all of these services, you can do image pushes if they have native support, or you simply build a container that accepts the commands you need. And this makes your continuous delivery strategy very, very reusable as well, because these deployment containers we're defining over here, you can have one deployment container that supports all of your applications or all of your microservices, and just use some context and some environment variables to obviously deploy to the right place at the right time. But now your deployments are all centralized in a single reusable image, fully taking advantage of Docker for continuous deployments. Now, one thing I want to say, and then we'll sort of begin to wrap this up, and we'll get into some questions in a few minutes. I talked a lot about these deployment containers. We looked at the ecosystem and looked at how you can build deployment containers for all these big players. Obviously, Codeship has a lot of this put together in our GitHub pages that are ready to go. And we've got more materials as well. But if you're wondering how would you go about building or creating or getting access to a deployment container, because you're not quite sure how you get there from where you're at today, even if the concept makes sense, there's two fairly good rules of thumb. One is we've got a bunch of them already made. Take a look at our GitHub or ask us a question. We may have something that can help you already. And number two is Docker Hub has plenty more that are ready to go. And so if I go back over here and take a look, you can see on the Docker Hub, I've got an image with the Azure CLI. So even though Codeship doesn't have a deployment repo just yet for Microsoft Azure, although if you're watching this in the future, we will have one ready to go. So if you're watching this live, you've got to give us a little more time. We're working on an Azure deployment repo to help you out. But if you find this webinar a little bit down the road, we've probably already got that released. But if you wanted to build your own and customize it, you could just grab this Microsoft Azure CLI base image, wrap your Docker file around it so that you can credential into your Azure instance, and then run your deployment commands like every other scenario we've looked at or every other provider we've looked at. So again, look to see if we've made something that can help you out, and if we haven't, there's a good chance there's something official or unofficial on Docker Hub that can help you out. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Manny for a few minutes, and then we'll take some questions after that.
Thanks, Ethan. So yeah, just a quick wrap up from my side. Ethan walked us through the ecosystem for Docker deployment and hosting. We had a look at some orchestration and a little bit more. And then we had a closer look at how to use some of the most common deployment targets, and we saw examples on how to set up deployment then with Docker. And you also saw a little bit, like Ethan mentioned, a little bit of what our own Codeship CI and CD service for Docker can do. And if you are intrigued by it and want to give it a try, I encourage you to just sign up for a free plan. Go to codeship.com and sign up for a free plan. I'm also happy to announce that we just a few hours ago launched our GitLab integration. So if you're a GitLab user, you can start using Codeship now with GitLab as well. We are very happy to announce that today. And if you want to learn more about that GitLab integration, you can head over to codeship.com/GitLab and get started immediately on the free plan. If you're interested to hear more about why we built this and hear GitLab talking about it as well, we're doing a webinar on December 15th about that. So feel free to sign up for that one if you're a GitLab user or interested in started using GitLab with Codeship. You can find the link to the webinar sign up on codeship.com/GitLab. But enough about GitLab right now. I want to mention one more time that we are sending an email later today about this webinar with the recording, slides, and some other relevant material. We talked quite a bunch about ebooks and other webinars, and I will summarize everything for you and send it to you later today. And let's get started with the Q&A session now.
Awesome. Thanks, Manny. So I'm going to jump in here and take a look at any questions we may have.
And it looks like I already answered everything via the chat, which is awesome.
Manny is on top of it.
Cool. So yeah, if some questions come to mind later, always feel free to send me an email at manny@codeship.com. And I see some questions coming in right now, so Ethan will definitely jump on them. But yeah, I just wanted to say, if some questions come to mind later, always feel free just to ping us, manuel@codeship.com. Go to our website and check out our resources. A lot of the questions you might have will be answered with the resources, webinars, ebooks we already previously published.
Awesome. So let me go through a couple of these questions that have just come in, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. So Eugene asks, if we use our own servers, we should set up Kubernetes and then make deploy via it. That's correct. So what we are conceptually having you do, if I go back here, is a container that can access your provisioning instance. So you'll need Kubernetes configured. And then what you can do from a Docker container, and by the way, we do have a great ebook in this covering this material, so we'll make sure to put this in the follow-up. What you can do is use a Kubernetes-based container in your continuous deployment process on a tool like Codeship to roll your cube and release your cube. But that actual infrastructure needs to already be in place to do it. This is just handling the automation of the deployment or preparation of the cube for it. Silas, do we have an ECS sample deployment? We don't have it specifically an ECS sample deployment. We are working on one, so we will have one coming out sooner rather than later. We do have a couple of AWS examples in general at a high level. It would be as simple as using the ECR push and switching the AWS commands we provided to ECS commands. But we do want to and need to provide an ECS example down the line, and it's something internally we're working on right now. And Orlando says how to handle image tags in a CD. So that's a great question. Every service provider is going to handle this a bit differently, to be totally honest with you. I'll show you how we handle it. So if I go back to, let's see, we can do this one. So if I have an image push step like we see here, I can provide an image tag and I can just give it a static string. So I can call it master. Or if I want, I can use one of a few different variables that we provide through the Go template object to provide my tag for the registry. So if you go to Codeship's documentation and you look up the steps documentation, you'll find a list of all the dynamic variables for an image tag. Or like I said, you can provide just a static string. By default, of course, if there's no tag, what's going to happen is just latest. And if she says, how do you deploy Docker containers to a production server that is not running Docker? It's a really good question. So if the production environment is not running Docker, you probably don't want to deploy the containers. You probably want to do something like we see here, where we're just running deployment commands. So again, you're just building a container to run commands. And so these can be standard deployment commands. They could be SSH commands. They could be even FTP commands if you build a deployment container capable of running FTP to your external server. So you're not going to be deploying the Docker image itself. You're going to be deploying the code inside of the Docker image. And you're just going to build a container that deploys that in whatever method you want. And we do have some SSH and FTP instructions in our documentation as well, if that's the route you're looking for. And Dane says, is Fabric 8 a similar alternative to the Codeship? I won't go too much into detail on that, but not quite. I mean, there's some overlap, and obviously a lot of different CI/CD tools handle problems in a lot of similar ways. We're really focused on continuous integration, continuous delivery, and on using Docker as the domain language to make it as flexible and custom as we can. So I think if you have some time, there's some other great recommended videos and webinars and content we've got put together in our resources section that hopefully will unpack what that means in more specifics. And Steven says, if I have EngineYard deployed via Codeship right now in the standard way, is this still the best way to deploy to EngineYard? I think the best way is hard to say because that's ultimately up to you. If you are starting to use Docker, and I assume you mean Codeship in the standard way, so Codeship's non-Docker infrastructure, that probably works fine for you. If you don't plan to switch to Docker, you're not switching to Docker, you can continue using Codeship's classic or Codeship's basic infrastructure. That's not going anywhere. What we've got here is our Docker or Pro-based infrastructure, which is just meant to be a lot more customizable and a lot more flexible, and both of them will deploy to EngineYard just fine. So I think the question just comes down to your own goals, not which version of Codeship is better for the specific task. And it looks like that's about it for the questions. And like Manny said, go ahead and get in touch with us after this. If anything else does come up, we'd be more than happy to talk to you about it more or answer any additional questions.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And I hope to see you next month when we will talk with the GitLab team about our GitLab integration. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.